Slavery. It was about slavery. Welcome to what I hope is going to be a brand new series on this channel called Dead Countries. We're going to talk about countries that used to exist, but don't anymore, and maybe focus on the ones that have a looming shadow over our society today. And I can't think of a dead country that looms heavily over, at least the US culture, more than the Confederate States of America. A dead country that was made and sustained entirely for the purposes of maintaining a state of slavery and white supremacy in the South of what is now the United States. You might think in a comment you're going to see someone write states' rights. At the founding of the United States, all 13 colonies had legal slavery. Shortly after, though, the northern states began to abandon the practice because, well, it was simply unprofitable. The South, though, came to depend on it. It was actually becoming unprofitable, but then Eli Whitney invented the cotton engine, or cotton gin as it's nicknamed. It's a device that makes it easy to separate a seed from a cotton ball, which then allows cotton to become much more profitable, and in a global market, cotton was very, very profitable. This brought slavery back into the big money business. Slavery had been baked into the American experience from day one. The Constitution itself has compromises made with the South in order to keep the practice of slavery alive. For the purposes of drawing districts for the House of Representatives, for example, the South was allowed to count black slaves as 3/5 of a person. You might have heard of this, it's called the 3/5 Compromise. Slavery then came to define the South. Slavery was cruel, oppressive, and horrifying in ways that we can barely fathom today. The South's dependence on slavery set the two regions on completely different economic trajectories. The North started to become more industrialized, started to become manufacturers, traders, while the South relied heavily on an agricultural economy, dependent on slave labor. Let's not mince words though, the South was perfectly happy to keep this balance if it meant that capitalists in the North could profit off of it. Many white people in the North also supported slavery because under a capitalist economy, if those slaves were ever made free, they saw them as competition for scarce jobs. One of the first laws passed in the United States was the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it legal for bounty hunters to look for escaped slaves in the North, or even in Canada at some points. These bounty hunters would look for anyone who tried to escape, or, failing that, anyone who looked like them. So the two factions kept a relatively safe political balance until the United States started to expand west. Crises started to emerge when territories were getting to the point where they needed to be integrated into the United States as full-blown states. If a slave state were to join the Union, or a non-slave state, then the Senate could be balanced in favor of the other, and both of them feared what the repercussions would be if the other were to have dominance. Although, let's be honest, the slaveholders did have the dominance in politics at this point. So when Missouri was ready to become a slave state, there was a crisis and a compromise in which Louisiana's territory, which is much larger than it is today, would not be allowed to have any more slaves above a certain line, with the exception of Missouri, and then in return, Maine would be added as a free state to keep the balance. There was a second Missouri Compromise when Missouri was integrated as a state, despite having in its constitution a ban on free blacks. Then the United States went to war with Mexico on extremely dubious terms, but that's a different video. And the result of the war was the United States annexing a vast amount of territory in what is today the American Southwest. They had to draw all sorts of new compromises. California, a large free state, but that went below the line where slavery was allowed in the United States, was admitted as a free state. The territory of New Mexico, today Arizona and part of Nevada, were set in with slavery allowed. As part of the compromise, the District of Columbia, Washington DC basically, had a ban on the sale of slaves there, and there was an implementation of a new, more forceful fugitive slave law to counter the rising abolitionist activists who were going to more and more desperate means to stop this horrific practice. But it became very clear the US would rather keep compromising and make bipartisan agreements to maintain the balance of slave and non-slave powers rather than address the festering infection at the core of American politics. In 1831, they implemented a gag rule which would ban Congress from even looking at petitions from people to stop slavery. And despite all of these capitulations to the South, Southerners were still convinced that there was a grand anti-slavery conspiracy theory, to the point where there was even a secret society in the 19th century called the Knights of the Golden Circle, who wanted to secede the South from the United States, join with parts of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean to make a new slave state, which is rich because Mexico and the Caribbean, by and large, had banned slavery by this point, so they would be bringing slavery back to these regions. Just imagine what these people would have been like if they had 8chan. Holy crap. At the same time, the Whig Party, the representative of Northern interests in the United States, was beginning to fall apart and replaced with a new Republican Party. The Republican Party started as a reaction to the expansion of slavery into the territories. They wanted to make sure that slavery did not leave the South. They wanted to make sure that the new territory, totally not stolen, would go to white yeoman farmers and not to big fat cat slave owners. And they did pretty well. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 despite many southern states taking him off the ballot. His election immediately caused a secession crisis. Many of the states that left explicitly left the United States, saying that they were doing so in order to preserve the institution of slavery. I mean, you might not trust me, I'm just some guy on the internet, but let me just give you a quote from Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy.
Okay, this is Mr. Beat reading this. This is not actually my words. These are Alexander Stephens' words. The new government, quote, rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth.
Also, girls don't like nice guys, Kekistan is just memes, and the CSA is gonna be red-pilled as fuck. Texas, in its secession declaration, mentioned slavery 21 times. States' rights. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, 4 upper southern states followed suit. So at this point, we now have the Confederate States of America. Its first capital was in Montgomery, Alabama, but in order to be a rallying call to border states, they put the capital in Richmond shortly after. And with that, the country was born as a state in civil war with the United States. So this is a country that was basically fighting for its own existence from day one. But you know, getting away from the Civil War aspect of it, what was the Confederacy? How did it function? What was its government like? Well, it was almost a carbon copy of the United States. In fact, both of them had George Washington as their stamps. The Constitution was almost word for word copied from the American Constitution, just with slavery enshrined and a 6-year single term limit on presidents. Oh, and no Supreme Court. Immediately, it suffered from issues of unionism. There were people in the South all over the place who did not want to leave and were still loyal to the United States and wanted to go back. So much so, the state of West Virginia was basically founded on this principle. In places like Appalachia and the Ozarks, large communities and entire populations were completely against the secession into the Confederacy. In 1863, a group of Unionists took over eastern Tennessee, and when Union troops landed in North Carolina, they were actually welcomed by Unionists. That is, until they started freeing slaves. Texas had very little support for the Confederacy. Basically, just white Anglo-Saxon people in Texas supported secession. In German communities and in Mexican communities, there was a strong distaste for it, and they wanted to go back to the United States. It led to draft resistance in the German and Mexican communities, and for the Texas government to launch massacres on Unionists. There was a lot of repression of Unionists. Because of people who wanted to go back to the United States, the CSA became very quickly pretty much a police state. The United States cracked down a lot on civil liberties too, but the CSA had it down to an art. Now let's talk a little bit about how the Confederate economy worked. It was still largely agricultural. They banked that they were going to survive by getting England and France to help because both England and France were dependent on American cotton. But the British had a large supply that they were sitting on, and they had already been developing cotton plantations in Egypt and India, so they just started to rely more on those. They also imported a lot of food from the United States, which meant that they did not want to anger Washington by acknowledging the Confederacy. Although the Confederacy did get a massive loan from French capitalists. I do wonder why French capitalists like slavery so much.
Capitalism, I think we can all agree, is bad and should be abolished.
From the get-go, the United States had a vastly superior economy, having the industrial base and the manufacturing base and the population that just outshone the CSA in every possible metric. The CSA had little to no industry to speak of. They focused entirely on agriculture. When your economy is dependent on farming, then losing land hurts a lot more. So, as the US started to move into and damage Confederate territory, the Confederacy started to really hurt economically, especially because the land was sometimes thrown away. Cotton and tobacco, which were two major exports of the Confederacy, both destroyed the soil that they grew on, and so there was this constant need to get more land. Not too long into the war, the CSA suffered from massive food crises. There were bread riots in the street. They had to punish farmers who were caught growing too much cotton and not enough food. The railway system in the Confederacy was also really badly organized. There was just less of it than in the United States, and they had an issue with gauges in that the distance between the two rails was different on different lines, which meant that trains were not able to move from one to the other. That meant that in a lot of cases, even in this disorganized patchwork of railways, they had to stop a train, take everything off, put everything onto a horse and buggy system. By the way, there was a horse shortage, and then move it to the station that was in the next town over that had a train station that wasn't connected or had a different gauge, and then load everything back onto trains. So it made getting things around, which, is really important in a war, much more difficult. So without help from the British and the French, they had to rely on just printing more and more money. They printed tons and tons of money, in fact. The inflation in the Confederacy was massive beyond belief. It was so bad that even today, Confederate dollar bills, historical artifacts, you can find on eBay selling for under $10. The government itself was weak and disorganized. The military was not standardized. Soldiers had to bring their own guns, which meant that they had to deal with different types of bullets. There's even one story of a Confederate soldier who came equipped with a musket that his family members had used in the Revolutionary War. So we were dealing with guns from all over the production stages. So the Confederacy was poorly equipped, had a bad economy, and a disorganized infrastructure. What could possibly go wrong? Well, they also were pretty bad at strategy. If you want to hear a little bit more, you can watch my Robert E. Lee video where I talk a little bit about it, but the CSA was on the back foot. It had a lot of things not going in its favor, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't have won. What caused the Confederacy to lose is that they relied on contemporary warfare, pitched battles, and traditional strategy, which is a losing bet when you don't have the resource advantage. Robert E. Lee was a brilliant tactician, but shit at strategy. What the Confederacy should have done is focus on unconventional warfare, like the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, for example. The Confederacy eventually collapsed when they lost the war in 1865. It led to the southern states being militarily occupied for several years, followed by a slow and painful reannexation process. But let's say they actually had gone to unconventional warfare. Do you think the Confederacy could have won? Well, in my opinion, sure they could have. If they had focused on damaging morale and ruining the war spirit in the USA, it could have been very easy for, say, the Democrats to win the 1864 election and for the Confederacy to be given its independence. Very likely, though, because of the change in the cotton market, the Confederacy, if it had survived, would be a super, super poor country. Slavery was also ending around the world, which meant that if the Confederacy hung on to it, they'd quickly become an international pariah. The combination of the death knell of slavery and the collapsing Confederate economy would likely lead to either a reunification movement very soon after what we would see as a civil war, or just them languishing as a backwater economic downturn poor place. I also imagine that means that there would be a lot of Confederate defectors, especially black people escaping from slavery into the United States, which would probably be a source of more international conflicts, even a second civil war, who knows? So after the collapse of the Confederacy, we had Reconstruction. Also, shortly into Reconstruction, Abraham Lincoln, the president, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth and was replaced by his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was much more sympathetic to the South than Lincoln. So in many ways, the Confederacy losing slavery did not ruin the Southern way of life because they got a lot of what they wanted. Class didn't change much. Black people who fought in the war and were recently freed got nothing, really. Many of them became sharecroppers on their former owners' land. The federal government eventually just gave up on the concept of Reconstruction. Many former Confederates managed to go right back into government, and because of terrorism in the form of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the return of white supremacist democratic governments, Jim Crow became the law of the land, which was a set of laws that kept black people extremely limited in what they could do, and white supremacy in the South continued. It was a very violent period. I suggested you watch a video I did about on the Colfax Massacre, which you can click on here. The failure of Reconstruction was a major injustice to black people in America that we're still dealing with today, to this very moment. The systemic and generational inequality between white people and black people, especially in the South, can tie its roots to this very decision. By the way, I want to take a quick moment to thank all the patrons for this video. If you want to become one yourself, you can just go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and pledge as little as $1 a month, and you get to see videos early, and there's all sorts of other perks you can get in on. If you don't want to sign up for a subscription, that totally makes sense. You can go to paypal.me/stepbackhistory and just give $1 or $2 as part of a tip. Otherwise, if you can't give financially, which I also totally understand, the best thing that you can do is share, subscribe, and watch more videos. Ever since the end of the American Civil War, there's been this morass of Confederate nostalgia. Hell, it's still on the flag of Mississippi. Here's the thing though, starting about the time that Civil War veterans started to die off in the early 20th century, children of veterans started to reinterpret the Civil War and the Southern cause specifically in something called the Lost Cause myth. They reinterpreted the entire Civil War to be about maintaining, quote unquote, the Southern way of life, which I think meant the calm aristocratic lifestyle of having to not have to do a whole ton of work because you own slaves. This is also where the states' rights argument started to come in, and when Southerners started to reinterpret the war and give it its new, very, very pompous nickname of the War of Northern Aggression. Overall, the Lost Cause myth was about minimizing and downplaying the role of slavery in the reasons for the causes of the Civil War and the reasons for secession in the first place. In order to believe in the Lost Cause myth, you almost have to have as bad a grasp on history as Dinesh D'Souza and throw out huge chunks of American history. So, obviously, tons of people believe it. So if you ever meet one, say, "Hey, Grandpa, a Canadian leftist on the internet said that you were wrong." And this Confederate nostalgia came up in another wave in the mid-20th century for reasons that I'm sure you might know.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Confederate flags and Confederate nostalgia came back in the mid-20th century as part of the white backlash against the civil rights movement. Most of the statues that exist today in places like, oh, I'm just gonna take a stab in the dark and say Charlottesville, are cheap, crappy statues raised in the 20th century explicitly as a statement against the civil rights movement. And this was just an ugly thing that just stayed in the South, and white people in the South didn't seem to mind much, and black people, as black people have done through a lot of American history, survived and put up with white people's bullshit until in Charleston, South Carolina, a man named Dylan Roof, with a Confederate flag on his jacket, walked into a historically black church and shot 9 people dead, which has since opened up a discussion about the legacy of Confederate symbols and maybe why we shouldn't be embracing this openly white supremacist slave-holding state that existed in the 1860s. And I think this is an important discussion to have. The United States is at a crossroads. The Confederacy and that kind of Confederate symbology stays as this dark infection at the center of the American experience. It's the infection that leads people's first instinct to say Blue Lives Matter in response to an unarmed black teenager being gunned down by a police officer. It's the infection that builds the conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim. It's the infection that puts a disproportionately high amount of black people in prison, putting them into a new form of work servitude, basically a new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander would say. It's the infection that in small and big ways affects black people in America every single day. And this is not something that we've solved. Barack Obama getting elected didn't solve this infection. The 90s colorblind liberal idea did not solve this infection. Hate crimes are on the rise. Right now, right-wing white supremacy is the #1 source of terrorism in the United States and has been for a very long time. The Lost Cause myth and Confederate nostalgia is dangerous. The Confederacy was a country born out of hate and subjugation, and it's one we firmly need to relegate to the dustbin of history. So yeah, be sure to watch that Colfax Massacre video and let me know if this is a series, if you want to see more videos on dead countries that no longer exist. And if you want to see more of them, go watch some more Step Back videos. YouTube now rewards session time, so keep watching. I'll see you guys next time.